The dust cloud on the horizon had been visible for near an hour before the stagecoach finally rumbled into view. Jake Morrison stood on his porch, hat in hand, watching the approaching wagon with a mixture of anticipation and dread. After 6 months of correspondence with Miss Catherine Hartwell of Boston, his mail-order bride was finally arriving at his ranch in the Colorado Territory. He'd spent the morning cleaning himself up proper, shaved his beard down to a neat mustache, put on his good shirt, and even polished his boots. The ranch hands had been giving him grief about it all week. But Jake didn't care. A man deserved to look respectable when meeting his future wife. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of his gate, and the driver climbed down to retrieve the luggage. Jake took a deep breath and walked forward, his prepared greeting ready on his lips. But when the passenger door opened, the woman who stepped down wasn't at all what he'd expected. Where Catherine's letters had described herself as refined and delicate, with golden hair arranged in the latest fashion, this woman was tall and sturdy built, with auburn hair that had clearly been fighting its pins during the long journey. Her traveling dress was practical brown wool rather than the silk Catherine had mentioned, and her boots were sensible leather, not the dainty slippers he'd imagined. Most surprising of all, she looked him straight in the eye with a directness that spoke of someone accustomed to hard work and harder decisions. "Mr. Morrison," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm Rose Hartwell." Jake stared at her for a moment, his mind racing. Rose Hartwell, not Catherine. The sister Catherine had mentioned only once in passing, the one who insisted on managing father's business affairs in the most unladylike manner. "Ah, yes, I'm Jake Morrison," he managed, taking her hand. Her grip was firm and confident. "But I was expecting—" "Catherine." Rose's expression grew serious. "Mr. Morrison, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. May we speak privately?" Jake led her onto the porch, acutely aware of his ranch hands trying to look busy, while obviously straining to overhear every word. Rose sat down on the wooden bench, smoothing her skirts with practiced efficiency. Catherine fell gravely ill with pneumonia just 2 weeks before she was to depart. Rose began without preamble. The doctor said the journey would likely kill her in her weakened state. Jake's heart sank. After months of planning, of imagining a future with someone who shared his dreams of building something lasting in this wild territory. "I'm truly sorry for your loss of expectation, Mr. Morrison. I know how much this arrangement meant to both of you. But Catherine asked me to come in her place. Not as a bride, you understand, but to explain the situation in person and offer whatever assistance I could in helping you find another suitable wife." Jake looked at this unexpected woman more carefully. There was something in her manner that suggested she wasn't telling him everything. "That's mighty considerate, Miss Hartwell, but surely a letter would have sufficed. It's a dangerous journey for a woman traveling alone." Rose met his gaze steadily. "I had my own reasons for wanting to see the territory. Catherine spoke so highly of your ranch and your character in her letters. I confess I was curious to see such a place, and such a man could truly exist." Something in her tone made Jake wonder if Miss Rose Hartwell had been reading more of his correspondence with her sister than was strictly proper. "Well then," Jake said, rising to his feet, "I reckon you'll be wanting to rest up before heading back. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. I'll have my housekeeper, Mrs. Chun, prepare the guest room. Actually," Rose said, standing as well, "I was hoping we might discuss a different arrangement entirely." That evening, Jake sat across from Rose at his kitchen table, trying to make sense of what she'd just proposed. Mrs. Chun had outdone herself with dinner, roast beef, fresh bread, and apple pie, but Jake had barely touched his food. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," he said slowly. "You want to stay on as my ranch manager?" Rose nodded, cutting another precise bite of beef. "I've been managing my father's shipping business for 3 years since a stroke. I understand ledgers, supply chains, and personnel management. From what Catherine shared your letters, you've been struggling to keep reliable help and manage the business side, while also working the land. Miss Hartwell, with all due respect, ranching isn't like shipping. It's dangerous work, and you think because I'm a woman I can't handle it?" Rose's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Jake caught a glint in her green eyes that told him he was treading on dangerous ground. I think because you're a lady from Boston, you might not understand what you're getting into. Rose set down her fork entirely. Mr. Morrison, I've spent the last 3 years managing crews of longshoremen, negotiating with ship captains who'd sell their own mothers for passage money, and keeping my father's business profitable during the worst economic downturn in a decade. I've dealt with strikes, storms, and shipping disasters. What exactly do you think I can't handle about cattle and ledgers? Jake had to admit she had a point. And truth be told, he was drowning in paperwork and administrative details that took time away from the work he actually knew how to do. What about propriety, he asked. A single woman living on a ranch with a bachelor rancher? The townspeople would have plenty to say about that, which is why I propose we marry. Jake nearly choked on his coffee. I beg your pardon? Rose's cheeks had colored slightly, but her voice remained steady. A business arrangement, Mr. Morrison. You need a wife to manage your household and help with the business. I need a new start. Boston holds nothing for me now except memories of caring for an invalid father and managing a business I'll never be allowed to truly own. She leaned forward slightly. We could make a good partnership. I'm not asking for romance or intimate relations, simply a practical arrangement that benefits us both. Jake stared at her. This wasn't at all how he'd imagined this conversation, going when he'd been preparing to meet Catherine. But as he looked at Rose, really looked at her, he found himself considering it. She was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with delicate beauty and everything to do with intelligence and strength. Her hands, though soft, showed signs of real work. And the way she'd handled herself today, traveling alone across dangerous territory and then calmly proposing a business marriage to a complete stranger, suggested a kind of courage he couldn't help but admire. What happens if one of us changes our mind? He asked. About the business arrangement? Then we discuss it honestly, like adults, Rose replied. I'm not proposing we trap each other, Mr. Morrison. I'm suggesting we help each other build something worthwhile. Jake looked around his kitchen. At the dishes he never seemed to get properly clean, at the papers scattered across his desk in the corner, at the ledger books that always seemed to show more questions than answers. Then he looked back at Rose, who was waiting patiently for his decision with the kind of calm confidence that suggested she'd be just fine whatever he chose. All right, Miss Hartwell, he said finally. Let's try it. But we do this proper. We'll have the preacher marry us, and we'll tell folks the truth about it being a practical arrangement. No point in starting a marriage with lies, even if it is just business. Rose smiled then, the first genuinely warm expression he'd seen from her since she'd stepped off that stagecoach. I think that's very wise, Mr. Morrison. And please call me Rose. Jake, he replied, extending his hand across the table. When she took it, her grip was firm and warm, and Jake found himself wondering if this practical arrangement might turn into something neither of them had quite planned on. 3 months later, Jake stood in the same spot where he'd first seen Rose step down from that stagecoach, but now he was watching her direct a loading of cattle for shipment to Denver. She'd taken to wearing split-riding skirts and practical boots, and her auburn hair was braided back in a way that stayed neat even during the dustiest work. Mrs. Morrison, called Tom Bradley, his best ranch hand. Should we load the yearlings in the front car or the back? Front car, Tom. Rose called back without looking up from her clipboard. Better weight distribution, and we can unload them first in Denver. Jake shook his head in amazement. In 3 months, Rose had reorganized his entire operation, negotiated better prices with the railroad, and somehow managed to turn what had been a barely profitable ranch into a thriving business. She'd also transformed his house from a bachelor's sparse quarters into an actual home, complete with curtains, decent meals, and furniture that matched. More surprisingly, she won over every one of his ranch hands through a combination of fair treatment, practical knowledge, and what Tom had called the ability to outcuss a sailor when the situation calls for it. The only problem was that Jake found himself thinking less and less about their business arrangement and more about his wife. It had started small, appreciating the way she laughed at his stories over dinner or the efficient way she moved through the kitchen in the mornings. Then he'd begun noticing how her eyes lit up when she talked about improvements to the ranch, or the way she unconsciously hummed while working on the ledgers. Last week, when a sudden storm had trapped them in the house for 2 days. They'd spent hours talking by the fireplace about everything from books to dreams for the future. Jake had realized with startling clarity that he looked forward to those conversations more than anything else in his day. The trouble was, he had no idea how Rose felt about their arrangement, and he was terrified of ruining what they'd built by wanting something she'd specifically said she wasn't offering. "Jake!" Rose's voice interrupted his thoughts. She was walking toward him, having finished with the cattle loading. "You look like you're wrestling with something serious." "Just thinking about how much things have changed," he said honestly. Rose stopped beside him, following his gaze to where the loaded train was preparing to depart. "Good changes, I hope?" "The best," Jake said, then took a deep breath. "Rose, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know you can answer honestly without worrying about our arrangement." She turned to face him fully, and Jake saw something in her expression that might have been anticipation. "When you proposed this business marriage," he began carefully, "you said we could discuss it if either of us changed our mind about the terms." "Yes," Rose said quietly. "Have you changed your mind?" "I have," Jake admitted. "I've found myself wanting something more than a business partnership." Rose's face went very still. "I see. I've come to care for you, Rose. More than care for you. And I wondered, hoped maybe, that you might have come to feel something similar." For a long moment, Rose didn't respond. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. "Jake Morrison," she said, reaching up to touch his face gently. "I've been hoping you'd say something like that for weeks now." "You have. I came here running from a life that felt like a cage," Rose said. "But somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't just running from something. I was running toward something. Toward you. Toward this place. Toward a life I could never have imagined wanting." Jake covered her hand with his own. "So we're changing the terms of our arrangement?" "We're changing everything," Rose said softly. "If you're willing to take on a wife who's going to want to be your full partner in this ranch, who's never going to be content just managing the household." "Rose Morrison," Jake said, pulling her closer, "I wouldn't want you any other way." As the train whistle blew and the cattle car began to move, Jake kissed his wife properly for the first time. Not the brief, formal kiss they'd shared after their wedding ceremony, but the kind of kiss that spoke of partnership and passion and a future they'd build together. When they finally broke apart, Rose smiled up at him with eyes that sparkled with mischief. "I should probably confess something," she said. "What's that?" "I may have read a few more of your letters to Catherine than was strictly proper. You sounded like exactly the kind of man I'd been hoping existed somewhere in this world." Jake laughed, spinning her around in the dusty yard. "So you came here planning to steal your sister's fiancé?" "I came here planning to see if the man who wrote those letters was real," Rose corrected. "Stealing you was just good fortune." As they walked back toward their house, their home, Jake reflected on the strange turns life could take. He'd sent for a delicate bride from Boston and gotten instead a strong, capable partner who challenged him, supported him, and somehow made him a better man than he'd ever thought he could be. Sometimes, Jake thought as Rose slipped her hand into his, the best things in life were the ones you never thought to ask for